Hey everyone, today I am back in Lost Ark to talk about our newly released class Wildsoul. She's been out for a little over 2 weeks, been playing her quite a bit, experimenting with the 2 different builds. And today I want to just kind of talk about the class, talk about the 2 different builds, teach you how to play each of these 2 builds in case you're curious about how she functions. And then towards the end of the video I'll also kind of go over how I ended up deciding on which build that I wanted to play and what I have done with my Wildsoul so far. So, as with every class, we have 2 main build paths to choose from. We have a spec build and a crit build. The spec build is going to be focused on the shape-shifting skills, where you're going to be switching between your human, your bear, and your fox form. Very much so a builder-spender playstyle where you're building up 3 different identity gauges to then eventually work towards an identity skill that deals a whole lot of damage. So, builder-spender, kind of more of a sustain DPS class as well, because you're going to be throwing out a lot of different skills quite frequently, and then you're going to be building up to a very large number with your identity skills. On the other hand, the crit build is actually more of a burst build, where you are mostly going to be looking to play around your cooldowns, and then you're trying to get out multiple burst rotations during one identity usage. So when you activate your identity, you transform into the Phantom Beast Awakening state, and during this state you actually can't use transformation skills anymore. So instead of transforming into the animals, we're going to be using a phantom version of these skills, where the animals will come out and do the attack while you can still go and do other things. So it's not quite a summoner playstyle, because the animals don't just spawn and do their own thing. They kind of still do the same skill that you do on the transformation build. However, it's just kind of like a spirit version of the animal that comes out and does the attack, and then it kind of like goes away again. So that's kind of like the main difference between the 2 builds. The spec build is where you're transforming into the animals, doing the skills yourself, building and spending of your identity gauges, whereas with the crit build, you just build up your main identity gauge, you activate it to go into your burst mode, and then during that burst mode you want to get out multiple rotations of your damage skills. But because those damage skills all share a cooldown, you just burst, you wait a little bit, you've got some downtime, you burst again, downtime, burst again, rinse and repeat. So that's kind of the TLDR of how the 2 playstyles work, but how does it actually work in practice then? Well, let's take it to Trixion and let me show you. So let's start out with the spec build. Now with the spec build we have the entirety of our identity gauge that we're going to be playing around with. We have the main gauge. This is going to be built up by using our green skills, which are also our human skills. So we have our synergy, we have our counter, and then we have our huge gauge generating skill. These 3 are going to be the main sources of how we build up our main identity gauge. The side gauges then are going to be filled up by using our shapeshift skills. So we have the fox skills right here, that's 1, this is another, and then we have our 3rd one over there. And then the bear gauge has our T skill, the boulder bear, and then also a little belly flop that you can do at the boss as well. Those will be building up our bear gauge. Now, as you can see, all of these skills also drained our human gauge. So if I transform back into my human, you can see that I'm now slowly going to be building up the gauge again. Then I can throw out some skills to speed it up. But we need this center gauge in order to kind of fuel our transformation skills or our shapeshift skills. Now, with the shapeshift skills, we're going to be building up the 2 side gauges. They're already filled because I was in Trixion over here. But when you are then in the correct transformation and the gauge is full, you can then press the Z key to activate your identity skill, and then the same thing for the bear, which looks like this. So how do we go about building up these gauges then? Well, so over here we're building up the human gauge, and then we can go and use some transformation skills, and as you can see, every time I use a skill it is going to be building up our side gauges. Now, there is another way how we can fill up all 3 of our gauges, and that is by quite simply being inside the correct transformation. So right now I'm in my human form, my center gauge is going to slowly be building up. And if I now transform into my fox form, you can see that my fox gauge is going to slowly build up as well. So when you're playing around downtime, you can just use one of your transformation skills, or you can also exit out of your transformation by pressing the X key, so that you can build up the gauge that you want to build up. Is your center gauge almost empty? Transform back into a human so that when the boss comes back, you've got like half a gauge back or something like that. Or if your gauge is already full, and you can see in this case, well, the bear gauge is kind of looking empty, just transform into a bear during the downtime walk around like this goofy looking thing, and then you'll just slowly build up the bear gauge so that when the boss comes back, you might have access to your identity skill, or will at least be quite a bit closer to getting it. Now, there is one more thing to talk about, and that is this thing you can see next to my character. I'll go to a more darker place in Trixion. The ferocity stacks. So every time I use a transformation skill, doesn't matter if it's a bear or a fox skill, I'm going to be building up these ferocity stacks, and these cap out at 3 stacks. The way how you lose them is by transforming back into a human. So in other words, you want to kind of try and get 3 transformation skills out back to build up to those 3 stacks. Each stack has a different effect, and you kind of want to build up to 3 stacks regardless, because that's where you get all 3 of the bonuses. However, they're especially important when it comes down to using your identity skill, because once you unlock the 4th node, your enlightenment tree, you get a 40% damage buff on your identity skill when you have 3 ferocity stacks, and then it will also consume those stacks. So if I were to just, let's say, build up my adrenaline real quick, I then go 1, 2, and 3 to build up my 3 stacks, and I now use my Z key, you can see that I now consume my ferocity stacks, and now my identity did 40% more damage. And then the same thing for the bear, you can just go 1, 2, and 3, and then use your identity skill right here. Now, to make it a little bit easier again as well, our 6 shapeshift skills, I guess, this includes our T skill, they all share a similar cooldown. So we have these 3 skills on the right over here. These all have a 24-second base cooldown, and then the ones on the left, these 2 and our T skill, have a 30-second cooldown. Now our T skill might be 50 seconds, but if you remember on the Arc passive 3, we do have this little thing in the leap tree over here which shortens the cooldown by quite a bit. That is also going to be helping our T skill stay aligned with the other 2 longer cooldown skills. So what it then kind of turns into is you just build up enough main identity gauge with your human skills, then you use the 3 short skills together, and then again you can just build up gauge if you want to do that, and then you use the 3 long skills together. And the only thing that you need to pay attention to when you're using these triplets of skills together is that you end in the correct transformation. So right now my fox gauge is almost full, so I can, for example, use 1, 2 bear skills, and then the 3rd one I use a fox skill, so that I now have access to my fox identity with my 3 ferocity stacks. And then right now I can see that my bear gauge is almost full, so I could go 1, 2 fox and then 3 bear, and then I could just kind of chill in the bear form until it fills, but feels like it's still a little bit too far away, so I'm just going to use another rotation of skills to fill that one up, because of course you do want to reapply your synergy and your adrenaline stacks and that kind of stuff. And then there you go, you can use it like that. So that's kind of like the only thing that you're paying attention to when you're using your rotation like this, is that when you end your 1, 2, 3 rotation, that you finish in the correct form so that you can use your identity when you have 3 stacks ready. Another cool thing is that your awakening fills up your main gauge all the way to full. So use my awakening right here, you can see that my gauge is now completely full, and that is especially useful for when you want to get out a huge burst after some downtime or at the start of a fight. Now, when it comes down to starting a fight on Wildsoul, especially the Spec build, is you kind of want to use a stimmy. So when you start a fight, the center gauge will always be filled to the max, but the side gauges won't be. So if you use a stimmy, you can actually get the side gauges to be full as well. And if you then have your awakening ready at the start of the fight, you can pull out a huge amount of burst damage. So you can kind of like stack your adrenaline first, and then you go 1, 2, 3, first burst, 1, 2, 3, second burst. And then you can like reapply your synergy, use your awakening, and then you can just do that again. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and this time I'm going to end with the fox form, because my fox identity is about ready. And then you can just end your burst like that. So if you have downtime and you're able to just let your charges of your abilities come back, because as you can see, all of my shapeshift skills have at least 2 charges. This one even has 3. This one also doubles as a counter, by the way, which is quite nice. You have 2 counters on this build. But that's how that kind of works. And then after you come out of downtime, your main gauge is full. You can just pelt out a bunch of skills back to back, which feels pretty good. And then you can just very quickly build up your gauges like so. So that's basically how the Spec build works. You just use your main gauge, make sure you have enough to support 3 back-to-back transformation skills, and then when your Z key is ready, make sure that you end your 1, 2, 3 combo into the correct state so that you can then use your identity skill, rinse and repeat. So that's the spec build. Let's then move on to the crit build. So here we are with the crit build. Now, because this is Trixion, my side gauges are filled up a little bit, but the crit build does not interact with the side gauges because we're not using transformation skills. And if we're not transforming into the animal, we also can't build up the side gauges because you need to actually transform in order for that to work. So if I were to use my bear skills right here, as you can see, the gauge is not moving. Now, with this build, the main difference is that you always stay a human. Well, technically you transform, but your skills will always keep you in your human form. And I'm gonna change the tripod on one of my skills real quick for this one so you can see the comparison. So on the spec build, this has you transform into a bear and pick up the boulder, whereas with the crit build, you can see that the bear just kind of jumps out and I can still just move around, do my own thing, throw out some other animals as I see fit. But we use a different tripod on this build for it to deal more crit damage, because of course we are a crit focused build. We want to have as much crit rate as possible, nearing 100% when we're in combat, so that we can basically crit everything, because all of our skills have somewhere between a 500 and 700% crit damage ratio, which is of course quite a bit. So what does this build then aim to do? Well, we are only going to be interacting with our main identity gauge, and that is because once it is full, we can activate it with our Z key to go into the Phantom Beast Awakening state. As you can see, I now have some foxtails. I also have some ears, although the ears you can't actually see because of my outfit. Now, while in this form, we are faster, we get movement speed and attack speed. We also get a nice crit damage bonus. Once you unlock the 4th node on your awakening tree, you also get a damage bonus, and we also get a new spacebar, which is a very fast and snappy spacebar. Although it does have a little bit of like an end time where you can kind of just wait. Let me quickly get back into my state. If you just spacebar and you don't immediately do anything, you still get extra super armor at the end of your spacebar. But if you don't, then you can just like very quickly go back to casting skills if you want to do that. Very important, because during the burst state, this build plays incredibly aggressive, because you want to get your cooldowns out of your damage rotation as soon as you possibly can, because you want to get 3 bursts out every identity. Now, something else you might have noticed is that I am constantly siphoning stacks from the boss, and I'm quickly going to recover resources. These are going to be very important for when we want to use our 3 rotations. So these stacks are going to do 2 things. 1, it's going to be recovering MP for us, and 2, it is going to be giving us cooldown reduction to our skills. So if I were to use my damage rotation right here, you can see everything is on about a 20-second cooldown. If I press my identity button, everything just refreshed. Now, it doesn't always give you a full refresh. That only happens when you have 20 stacks. But as you can see, I have about 8 stacks right now, and that just gave me about 10 seconds worth of cooldown reduction. So depending on how many stacks you have, you get more cooldown reduction, you get more of a mana refund, and that is how we are then going to be playing around, how we're going to be bursting with this class. Also, just like with the spec build, when we are just in our human form, not inside of our identity, the main gauge is going to slowly fill up over time, and we can of course speed that up by just hitting some skills on the boss. Now, the way how we burst depends on how we use our identity skill. So this is one way, where we first do our normal burst rotation, and then we immediately use our identity skill, and then we just wait around a bit, we apply our synergy. We can throw out our crows as well, but this doesn't really do a lot of damage. And then our rotation is ready again, so we do our second burst, and then we use our identity a second time, and then we wait a few seconds, and then we do our third burst, after which we can manually exit our identity state if we wish to do so, or we can just let it run out. Choice is yours. Now, after this is done, we can then very quickly build up our identity gauge again, so that by the time our damage rotation is ready, we get our full gauge ready again as well. The second way how you can burst on this is by doing a backloaded burst. So you do our first rotation at the start, like before, but now we just wait. Instead of using our identity skill, we just let our cooldowns come back naturally, and then we get to burst twice at the end of our identity. This is something that can be useful if you have a damage window coming up, like let's say for example on Behemoth, he's about to drop his head, so when you're attacking the wings, you just wait with using your big DPS skills, and then you just burst twice when the head is available, or if you wish to use something like an Atropine, for example. Another thing that you can do with this is if you know how long there is going to be downtime for, like with a specific mechanic, then you can also already preemptively activate your identity gauge, and then you can just be sitting in there for the first like 15 to 20 seconds or something while the mechanic is going on. You're running around, you're dodging mechanics, and then by the time that the boss is going to come back, or when a stagger check is about to start, or like whatever really, whenever you can go ahead and hit the boss again, you can then do your first rotation and immediately reactivate to do your second burst. So this is something you can do to kind of abuse downtime. I don't know all the timings for this, but there's a couple of mechanics that come to mind. Like for example on Belshazzar Gate 1, the 240 bar mechanic. If you know when to activate your identity, you can kind of do that so that when the boss comes back, you can just immediately do 2 burst rotations with an atropine or something, because that's also usually where your supporters will have full buffs as well, etc. So that's something that you can do to abuse that. Doing a burst at the end of your identity cycle does delay the next usage of your identity state, because you get less cooldown reduction when your state ends. Because of course, if you use your second usage of your skill in the middle of your identity, you get about 10 stacks back by the time your identity ends, whereas if you use your identity skill towards the end of your identity state, you only get like 5 stacks back or something like that. So you get less cooldown reduction, which then leads into your next rotation being a little bit slower. But that's just something that you'll kind of have to get used to when you play this class, when you should just burst periodically, when you should burst at the end or something. It's just something that you'll get used to, or that you can choose depending on like the situation. So that's just something that you'll learn with experience. And then last but not least, we have our T-skill and our awakening. These one are pretty straightforward. Just when you're inside of your burst state, just use your T-skill, use your awakening. They just deal damage. There's no gauge generating aspect this time around. They just deal a bunch of damage. And of course, we can also end our identity state early by pressing the X key. And then we can just like slowly build up gauge again during a mechanic or something like that. So that when the boss comes back, we can immediately go back to bursting. So those are the 2 different builds. That's how they play. What did I decide on then? Well, initially when Wildsoul was released in Korea, saw some gameplay. The crit build, the Phantom Beast Awakening build, that is the one that caught my interest the most, because I liked playing around as like your human form and then essentially summoning the spirit versions of these animals to kind of like do the attacks alongside you. I just liked that aesthetic more. And I'm generally also somebody that enjoys crit swift builds more than I do spec builds. The main exception of that is my main character, my Arcanist, but Empress Arcanist, while it is a spec build, it plays like a swiftness build. So I am somebody that just enjoys these high uptime classes, Wind Fury Aeromancer, Night's Edge Soul Eater, AT Scouter, those kind of things. So I was thinking crit build is probably going to be something like that. Now, the crit build for Wildsoul ended up being more of a burst build than a sustained DPS build. So that's why I was like, let me go and check out the spec build instead. And the spec build is a little bit more of a sustain uptime class. It is a bit slower than the crit build because average costs per minute is lower than with the crit build. But it feels more like a steady stream of skills that you're throwing out there. So that is why I also waited until now to make this video, because I want to get another set of weekly raids under my belt playing the spec build this time around. Because the first 2 weeks I played the crit build for my raids, this week I played the spec build for my raids. And I had to say, it felt pretty amazing to play. And the like leniency on the build, or the flexibility, I guess would be a better word to put it, it's just incredible, because you get to transform into one of your 3 shape-shifting forms to build up identity gauge that you need the most during downtime. And then when you come out of downtime, now all of a sudden you can just throw out multiple usages of your DPS skills, because you have those 2 charges on all of your DPS skills. So it feels incredibly lenient to play, very flexible. You can hold skills for a specific pattern. When there's downtime, you're not really losing out by not using your skills, because they can just start gaining that second charge. Feels pretty good to play. However, it is of course still slower to play. It feels more sluggish because you're a full spec build, you don't have any swiftness, you don't really have many attack speed and movement speed sources. Now, transforming into your Fox does give you attack speed, movement speed, but of course it's not the same as if you're just always capped at 140% for both of them, like you have with the crit build. So while the build has a lot of things going for itself, honestly, like it's just so flexible, it does a lot of damage, capitalizes really hard on downtime, is amazing in burst windows like I just showed you before, double rotation with your awakening or something, you can push out a lot of damage on that build. Feels incredibly good to play. However, I just really like the snappiness of the crit build. It feels really smooth to play, like playing around at 140% movement speed, attack speed, just feels really good. And also, I just like the aesthetic more. So even though both of the builds are incredibly fun to play, they both feel really good, they both perform really good as well. In the end, I was kind of torn to choose between the two because the Spec build is kind of like a little bit more my playstyle. The Swiftness build just feels a little bit better because you have that maxed out movement speed, attack speed. And so in the end, I just decided to go with the aesthetic that I liked the most, which is going to be the crit build for me. So it's been a difficult decision, but I'm probably just going to stick with the crit build for now. I might switch between the two builds a little bit here or there in the coming weeks to kind of like get a feel for things a little bit more. When I'm like, okay, maybe I should give the Spec build another try, or maybe I should try the crit build again on this fight or something like that, to kind of see which of the two builds I like the most, because it's just been a very difficult decision. And luckily enough, because this is my event character, I have enough event gems to just freely switch between the two builds. I even have enough gems that I can just switch between the two gem pages. I don't even have to re-roll my gems because we got enough event gems to support both of the builds. So that feels pretty good that I don't really need to re-roll things like we would have to do before. So it feels pretty good that I can just switch between the two builds on the fly essentially, which is something that I'll probably end up doing in the coming weeks to just kind of try out the two builds a little bit more. So that I'm like sure which of the two builds that I like the most and that I want to spend the most time on. Now in terms of progression, I ended up getting her to 1670 on the first day. I had a lot of materials prepared for that. For tier 4 I didn't have to buy a single thing. Tier 3 materials, they lasted me until 1620, but for advanced honing I basically had nothing left in terms of destruction and guardian crystals. Luckily enough I had all the shards and the leapstones that I needed, and also the orejas I believe. But for the red and the blues I had nothing left after honing to 1620, so I had to buy all of those from the market. It was quite expensive, but it was definitely worth it, because if I hadn't advanced honed in tier 3, then I definitely would not have made it to 1670. I would have just left at 1660 and then she would have been there for a while. Now eventually, after the end of week 2, I also ended up pushing her to 1680 because like it was just possible, and I just thought to myself, well, I have enough resources and she's basically 10 item levels honed less than my alts, because all of my other alts are 1670 without advanced honing. So I was like, let's just get my Wildsoul to 1670 with advanced honing as well. So that would then put her to 1680. Then I get access to the new Guardian raid, new Chaos dungeon, and then that would just like let me build up some more resources as well. And I had the materials ready for it, so that's why I ended up going for that. In terms of elixirs, they're basically all damage lines except the chest piece. That one has one defensive line. And then for my Transcendence, I managed to finish the Armor Transcendence on week 1, and then the weapon had to wait until week 2 because I didn't have enough Behemoth scales to finish level 7. I did get level 6 in week 1, but level 7 had to wait for the second week. For the Arc passive, it's very different now how we get all of our pieces. So at 0 piece Aegir, you're essentially 3 piece Arc passive. When you get 2 Aegir pieces, you have 4 piece Arc passive, and then when you have 5 Aegir pieces, you have 5 piece Arc passive. So right now on week 1, we were essentially still 3 piece Arc passive. On week 2, I converted some Belshazzar materials into Aegir materials, so I could get my second Aegir piece, because that would put me over the edge to get that extra point in the Arc passive tree. And then now I am waiting for, I guess, another 2 weeks for me to finish my Aegir set, so that I have the full Arc passive unlocked. With Belshazzar, the T skill becomes quite a bit better as well for both builds. For the crit build, it becomes bigger, so it's easier to hit. For the Spec build, it gets a second charge, so it really plays into that whole 2 charges on all of your DPS skills thing. And it also feels much better to play around if you have that extra charge on there. Makes things a lot more flexible. And yeah, that's kind of where she's at right now. She's 1680, she's basically finished with all the horizontal stuff. Waiting 2 more weeks to finish my Aegir pieces so that I have the entire Arc passive unlocked. And then it's just slowly working on my Karma system. Although I'll be taking it slow with that one. I'm going to be focusing more on my 1670 alts for the Karma system, so that they can unlock that 4th line on their Enlightenment. Because of course, she is 1680, so she already has access to that node, because of the ancient accessories that she does have. So that's Wildsoul. Those are the 2 builds. That's what I ended up doing with mine. Let me know in the comments down below what do you think about the class, which one of the 2 specs you ended up playing. If you maybe got any more questions about any of the playstyles, feel free to leave those down below as well. And with that, I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.